Northern Montana, January 1978. The kind of winter that made men wake before dawn just to check if the stove was still alive. The wind came down from Canada like it had teeth. It screamed across open land, clawed at roofs, and found every crack a man forgot to seal. That winter, something strange glowed every night from Vernon Hadley's old barn, a steady yellow light that did not flicker or fade, even when the wind howled at 40 miles an hour and the cold dropped far below zero. Folks noticed it, but no one paid it much mind, at least not at first. They assumed Vernon was working late, maybe fixing a tractor, maybe sorting tools. Ranchers worked odd hours, especially in winter. But the light stayed on night after night. It stayed on when storms rolled through and when the snow piled high against fences. It stayed on when most people were huddled close to their stoves, praying the fire would last till morning. What they could not see through the old barn's weathered boards was that Vernon was not working in that barn. He was living in it. Vernon Hadley was 42 years old, a ranch hand by trade, strong-backed and quiet-spoken. He had served with the Navy Seabees years earlier and learned to build things that lasted. In 1974, he had built himself a cabin east of the barn. It was a good cabin by frontier standards. Thick logs, hand-cut and stacked tight. A stone chimney that pulled clean. A place most men would have been proud to live in. But Montana winters have a way of finding weakness. The cabin sat on a small rise, open to the northwest. Wind hit it hard, day and night. No matter how well the logs were chinked, the cold found its way inside. The firewood pile sat 200 yards away, wrapped in tarps that never fully kept the snow out. Each armload Vernon carried in hissed and smoked instead of burning hot. Some mornings he woke to frost on the inside of his windows and breath that hung white in the air. By the winter of 1977, the math no longer worked. He was burning through more than a dozen cords of wood each season and still shivering. Propane prices had jumped. Deliveries were slow and not always reliable. Vernon spent more time cutting and hauling wood than tending his livestock. The problem was not effort. The problem was loss. Heat bleeding out through gaps, through drafts, through space that did not need to be warmed. Vernon was not a man who complained. He thought in terms of problems and fixes. Bigger fires would mean more wood. Better insulation would help, but only so much. One November afternoon, while helping a neighbor clear scrap from an old property, 2 valleys over, he saw the thing that changed everything. It was a Quonset hut, half taken apart, its curved steel ribs stacked in the dirt. Old military surplus from decades earlier. Corrugated steel arches bolted together into a simple tunnel shape, the kind the Army once used for storage and field hospitals. Light, strong, and when put together right, tight as a drum. The neighbor was tearing it down and wanted it gone. Vernon bought the whole thing for $60 and a case of beer. He did not plan to set it up outside. He did not plan to attach it to his cabin. He planned to put it inside his barn. The barn was big, 40 by 60 feet, built in the 1920s with thick beams and rough plank siding. It leaked light and snow dusted the floor through 100 tiny cracks, but it stood firm against the wind. Vernon cleared the center bay and leveled the dirt. He laid down a simple timber frame and began bolting the steel arches together, 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, 7 feet tall at the center, a half-round tunnel of silver steel. Sitting entirely inside the barn, with open space all around it, neighbors stopped by as the shape took form. They stood in the barn doorway, hands in pockets, watching him work. Some shook their heads, some laughed. "What are you building in there, Vernon?" one asked. "A place that stays warm," Vernon said. He packed sawdust 8 inches deep for the floor, covered it with planks, and cut a door into one end of the steel shell. Inside, he set a small barrel stove and ran the stovepipe up through the barn roof. He hung a kerosene lamp from the curbed ceiling and built shelves right into the steel ribs. It was plain. It was tight. It was small. That was the point. The idea was simple, even if Vernon never explained it out loud. The steel shell stopped drafts. The barn blocked the wind, The open air between them slowed the cold. A shelter inside a shelter. Less space to heat. Less heat to lose. Firewood stacked dry along the barn walls instead of buried in snow. It was not fancy, but it made sense. By early December, Vernon moved in. Word spread fast in a county where everyone knew everyone. People said he had given up, said he was hiding from winter like a scared animal. A carpenter named Charlie Brennan stopped by one afternoon and stared at the steel tunnel like it offended him. "That's not a home," Charlie said. "That's a grain bin." Vernon only nodded. Others were less kind. At the diner, men laughed into their coffee cups. At the post office, someone said real men faced winter head-on. Even his sister called from Billings, worried that people thought he was struggling. Vernon told her he was fine. Better than fine. Warmer than he had been in years. By mid-December, he stopped going into town unless he had to, not from shame, but from weariness. He did not need approval. He needed rest, warmth, and a way through the winter. Then the weather turned. On January 7th, warnings went out across northern Montana. A massive storm system was dropping out of Alberta. Snow, heavy and deep, winds over 50 miles an hour, temperatures falling fast. By January 9th, the cold had settled in hard, 18 below in the morning, 28 below by noon, the kind of cold that burned skin and made metal sting to the touch. Snow came down thick and sideways. Roads vanished. Power lines snapped. Ranchers rushed livestock into shelter and hoped it would be enough. Inside his barn, Vernon fed his small stove and listened to the wind batter the outer walls. The steel shell around him stayed calm and still. The lamp glowed steady. Outside, the blizzard was just beginning. The storm did not ease after the first night. It tightened its grip. By the morning of January 10th, the world outside Vernon Hadley's barn had turned white and silent, except for the wind. Snow buried fence lines and swallowed the road that led to his place. Drifts climbed higher than the hood of a pickup. The air itself felt heavy, like it could crush a man's lungs if he breathed too deep. Inside the barn, the wind roared through cracks in the siding, rattling loose boards and sending dust and chaff swirling across the floor. The sound was violent, a constant pounding that made it hard to think. But at the center of that chaos sat the steel tunnel Vernon called home. Inside it, the air was still. Vernon woke just before sunrise. He reached out from his cot and touched the stove. It was warm, not blazing, just right. He checked the small thermometer hanging from a steel rib. 61 degrees. He nodded once, calm, as if he had expected nothing else. He fed the stove a single split of dry pine and sat on the edge of the cot while it caught. No smoke, no struggle. The wood burned clean and bright. Outside, men across the county were already fighting losing battles. Chimneys smoked hard as stoves were pushed beyond their limits. Wet firewood hissed and steamed. Propane furnaces ran until tanks ran dry. Houses built to face normal winters began to fail under the weight of cold and wind that did not let up. That night, the temperature dropped again, 30 below. Then more. The wind found new ways to scream. It shoved snow through cracks and piled it against doors until some could not be opened. Power went out in pockets, then across whole stretches of land. Roads were impassable. Help was not coming. Vernon kept his routine. Every 2 hours, he fed the stove a small piece of wood. He wrote numbers in a notebook. Time, interior temperature, outside temperature guessed from the radio when it worked, later from memory and instinct. He was not proving anything. He was paying attention. On the second day, the storm deepened. Snow fell heavy and wet, then froze hard. Ice coated everything. Barn roofs groaned under the weight. One shed down the road collapsed sometime in the night. No one saw it happen. The wind swallowed the sound. Vernon stepped out of the steel shelter once that afternoon to check the barn. The cold hit him like a wall. His breath burned his chest. He took 5 steps, looked around, then went back inside. He shut the door and sealed it tight. The calm returned at once. Miles away, Ed Larson was not calm. Ed lived in a solid 2-story house with newer insulation and a propane furnace. The furnace stopped working on the second day when the tank ran dry. The delivery truck had never come. Ed turned to his wood stove. His firewood was buried under snow, soaked through from weeks of bad weather. He dug out what he could and dragged it inside. The wood barely burned. He fed the stove constantly, and still the temperature inside his house sank into the low 40s. At night, it dropped into the 30s. Pipes froze. Windows frosted over from the inside. Ed slept in layers of clothes, curled close to the stove, waking every hour to feed it. He thought about Vernon in his barn and shook his head. Poor bastard, Ed thought. Probably freezing to death in there. By the third day, people were running out of options. One family west of town lost their chimney when ice tore it loose. Smoke filled the house. They fled to their truck and ran the engine for warmth, burning fuel they could not replace. They stayed like that for 2 days until someone reached them by snowmobile. The wind did not stop. 50-mile-an-hour gusts hammered buildings without mercy. The sound alone wore people down. It was like standing beside a jet engine that never shut off. Sleep came in short bursts, if at all. On January 12th, the cold reached its worst. The official reading in Cut Bank hit 47 below zero. With the wind, it felt far worse. Diesel engines gelled. Cattle froze where they stood if they were not sheltered. Metal snapped if struck. Skin burned in seconds. Inside the Quonset cabin, Vernon sat in a chair with his boots off, sleeves rolled up. The thermometer read 62 degrees. The steel walls around him were warm to the touch. The small stove glowed steady, not roaring, not straining. He added a log, closed the door, and lay down on his cot. That night, while others woke again and again to stoke fires that could not keep up, Vernon slept through 8 full hours. No frozen breath, no numb fingers. When he woke before dawn, the thermometer read 55 degrees, the lowest it had been since the storm began. He smiled to himself and fed the stove. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken on the 6th day. The wind fell first, then the snow eased. The sky cleared to a hard blue that only comes after deep cold. The temperature was still brutal, but the worst had passed. When people began to dig out and check on one another, stories spread fast. How much wood had you burned? How cold did it get inside? Who lost power? Who lost livestock? Ed Larson was one of the first to move once a narrow path could be made. He rode a snowmobile north toward Vernon's place, worried about what he might find. He expected silence, maybe a dark barn, maybe worse. Instead, he saw Vernon outside splitting wood, steam rising from his back in the cold air. Ed killed the engine and stared. Vernon looked up and nodded like it was any other day. "You okay?" Ed shouted. "Doing fine," Vernon said. Ed pulled off his face covering, disbelief written all over him. "I damn near froze," he said. "Burned through everything I had." Vernon set the axe down. "Come inside," he said. Ed followed him into the barn. The wind was gone in there, replaced by still cold air. Then Vernon opened the door to the steel shelter. Heat poured out like a wave. Ed stepped inside and stopped short. A thermometer hung in plain view. 68 degrees. Ed let out a slow breath. "You're kidding me." Vernon shook his head and reached for the notebook on the table. "I kept track," he said. Ed looked down at the neat rows of numbers. Dates, times, temperatures, wood used. His hands tightened on the paper. "How much did you burn?" Ed asked. Vernon flipped a page. "Just over 100 pounds, he said. 6 days. Ed said nothing. He just stood there, the quiet warmth sinking into his bones, realizing that the man everyone had laughed at had been the most comfortable one in the county, while the storm tried to kill them all. And that was when the laughter outside finally stopped. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. Word traveled fast once the roads opened. In a place like northern Montana, a storm like that became the only topic worth talking about. Men compared frozen pipes, burned furniture, lost cattle, and nights spent awake feeding fires that never seemed to win. And in every conversation, one detail kept coming up. Vernon Hadley had been warm. Within days, people started showing up at his barn, not to laugh this time, to look, to understand. Vernon did not turn anyone away. He opened the steel door and let them step inside. Most reacted the same way. First surprise, then silence, then a long, slow nod as the truth settled in. The place was not fancy. A cot, a small table, shelves bolted to curved steel ribs, a barrel stove that looked too small to matter. But the air was warm and even. No cold corners, no drafts. No rush of heat escaping when the door closed. Vernon showed them the notebook. He did not brag. He did not argue. He just let the numbers speak. Dates and temperatures. Interior steady. Exterior brutal. Wood use so low it made seasoned ranchers uncomfortable to think about how much they had wasted. Charlie Brennan came by in early February. The carpenter who had called it a grain bin stood quietly inside the shelter. He tapped the steel with his knuckles and walked the length of the curved wall. He crouched by the stove and stared into the fire for a long moment. "You got lucky," Charlie said at last. Vernon shrugged. "Maybe," he said. Charlie nodded once. "Still," he said, "it worked." That was as close to an apology as Charlie ever gave anyone. By spring, the story had changed. Vernon was no longer the man hiding in his barn. He was the man who figured something out. A rancher south of town built a small steel-lined room inside his dairy barn and moved his family into it during cold snaps. Another man used an old grain bin and ran a stovepipe through the roof. None of them copied Vernon exactly, but they followed the same idea. Smaller space, less wind, dry wood, still air. The county extension agent visited with a camera and a notebook. He measured everything, took photos, asked careful questions. That fall, he wrote a bulletin about cold weather shelter efficiency and mailed it across the region. Some laughed it off, others saved it. The ones who had merely frozen paid close attention. Vernon never moved back to his old cabin. He sold it to a young couple and stayed in the Quonset shelter year-round. He added a small window for daylight and built a short entry to cut heat loss when opening the door. By his third winter, he could predict how much wood he would need within a few pounds. He slept through storms that rattled the barn walls and woke rested. The barn did not change much from the outside. It still looked old, still creaked in the wind, still glowed softly at night. But now, when people passed by and saw that steady light, they did not shake their heads. They understood. Vernon lived there for many years, long enough for the story to fade into local history, long enough for new winters to come and go. When asked once if he would do it again, he thought for a moment and said yes. Not because it was clever, not because it proved anyone wrong, but because when the cold came and survival mattered, it worked. The storm of 1978 became a reference point. People spoke of winters as before it or after it, and whenever someone talked about that blizzard, someone else would mention Vernon Hadley, the man who built smaller, the man who stayed warm, the man who understood that surviving winter was not about toughness, but about paying attention. The weather never cared what anyone thought was proper. It only cared what held. And Vernon's little steel shelter inside an old barn held when it mattered most.